It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Kyle Anderson, another one of these trade targets that people continue to suggest. It's come up multiple times. And so I had to go with Shawn Coleman, host of Locked On Grizzlies at Stats SAC on Twitter. First of all, Shawn, how you doing?
Doing well, John. It's a pleasure. And should I say an honor? It's an honor to talk with you. I will say that it's an honor to talk with you, sir.
You should feel honored. You should feel blessed is also a good word.
There's many other words, but we're live on this show, so I'll hush.
Yes. And we're trying to keep it PG, but you know, anything that shows your true deference to me as your ruler and God on the network.
Of course. Hey, it's Locked On Karalis, so I'm Locked On Karalis now.
That's it. All right. So people have brought up Kyle Anderson a ton. Obviously, I know you have an affinity for Kyle Anderson, but the setup here is that he makes the right amount of money for the Celtics to acquire him. He is 27, which on the Grizzlies seems to be outside of the time frame. And so I think Celtics fans think, hey, Kyle Anderson, possibly gettable. So let me ask you the question, Shawn. Is Kyle Anderson somebody that could be gettable this offseason for the Boston Celtics?
In a word, yes. In likelihood, no. And I don't mean to be that type of guy giving that answer.
No, I want it to be as realistic as possible here.
Well, I think that if you look at this from four different perspectives, the timeline you're talking about for the Grizzlies in terms of their timeline, it makes sense to trade present value for future value. And I also think that Kyle Anderson certainly fits the mold of being the fourth or fifth best player, a lead rotation guy to support the stars on a contender, then he should be as one of the top three guys on the team just trying to make the playoffs like the Grizzlies are. And I think also Boston, it fits for them, right? The only part of this that kind of makes it to where I can't say for certain there's just an absolute match there is I don't know if Boston puts together enough of a return that really makes the Grizzlies be like, okay, this makes us want to move off Kyle Anderson. I think in a vacuum, the value could be there, but with the fact that the Grizzlies have so much uncertainty in their young players besides Ja right now, they love their culture. Kyle Anderson is a big part of that, and he's come off his best year in Taylor Jenkins' system. I think they're going to have to be wowed more than just their motive. They have to be motivated to move Kyle instead of just, he's clearly expendable, if that makes sense. There's got to be a package that's sort of that wow factor. Looking at Boston, I can't honestly say that's there from my first look at it.
Yeah, and that's the problem, right? Because from Boston's perspective, we sit here and say the Celtics have $11 million left on the Gordon Hayward traded player exception. Kyle Anderson makes 9.9, and this is his final year of the contract. And we can say the rebuttal, I think, from Celtics fans would be, you're not going to re-sign him, are you? And if you're not, then why not get something for him? And the question is, what can you get? Now, of course, this is a Boston-centric perspective. Let's say the Memphis Grizzlies say, you know what, that's a good point. We are going to put Kyle Anderson up for up for bids. What do you think a realistic return can be? If you're saying Boston doesn't have it, what do you think a realistic return for Memphis on Kyle Anderson could be?
So the thing that I'll say is this, is that I actually more agree with the Boston perspective than I do the Grizzlies perspective personally. And the reason why is I agree. I think that Kyle Anderson, he makes $9 million now coming off the season that he did. I think he's in line for a multiple year deal, 3 years, $40 million, kind of like Kyle Kuzma just signed 3 years, $40 million on his next contract. Is that as a starter on the Grizzlies? I don't know. And if it's not, it certainly doesn't make sense from a contract standpoint. Or payroll standpoint for the Grizzlies, 3 players, Romeo Langford, Aaron Nesmith, and Robert Williams, plus some type of protected first. I think that if you combine one of those 3 players with the protected first for Boston, that is a reasonable offer for Boston. I think in a vacuum, Memphis should really listen. Do I think at the end they take it? I don't. But that type of offer, I think, is pretty reasonable for a player of Kyle's skill and the fact that he's an expiring contract.
Yeah, and see that to me, so I think right now Robert Williams is way off the table in a deal like this. Aaron Nesmith, I think, is off the table in a deal like this because I just think that he can become a lot of what you are hoping Kyle Anderson can do for you as a rookie, and Anderson is there to lead the bench, and you don't want to sacrifice your depth for this, and so that leaves us with Romeo Langford, which I don't think Romeo is such a wild card because no one knows exactly what he's going to be, and there's people like me who say, give him this 1 year under non-COVID circumstances, full off season after the wrist injury, and let's see. Maybe we can revisit this conversation around the trade deadline. But at that point, if he's not exactly what Boston wants, is he then what Memphis wants? And then the notion of a first. I'm not looking to give up a lot of first round picks right now because I think Boston is part of why they did the Kemba trade is to preserve their right to trade the 2022 pick and go through the 3, every other year picks and pick swaps for a potential star. So that might be a price too much for the Boston Celtics. So do you think that there are deals out there? You think that there's a team out there that can give Memphis that kind of deal? Because, and let me just put it this way. What you're saying is reasonable as far as what the value is. But if a team isn't out there giving you a good young player and sort of a protected first, then Boston doesn't have to give you that. Boston can be like, hey, we'll give you, 2 seconds and, you need some shooting. Here's Carson Edwards.
Yeah, and that's fair. The thing, though, that comes in play with Memphis is, of course, their roster. It has a lot of really good players. Carson Edwards, I don't know if he really has a future in Memphis. And so I think the Grizzlies, instead of taking like an offer for a second right now or 2 seconds right now, they're probably looking to try to maybe add to Kyle Anderson. In the ultimate mock draft that we're doing right now, in a simulated situation, I added a future Utah first to Kyle Anderson to get the 14th pick in this draft in that type of scenario. So my point is that it kind of, instead of selling Kyle Anderson for seconds, maybe you could do that at the deadline, but I rather think 2 seconds is not going to convince Memphis to move off Kyle Anderson this offseason. It could at the deadline in the right situation, but I think Memphis would rather hold on to Kyle Anderson or use him as a money matching aspect to get a better longer term piece moving forward.
I know you are personally a fan of Grant Williams and may be willing to trade John Morant for Grant Williams. No, that's a little but do you think there's any, because Grant is now, I do feel strongly that Grant Williams, though he had a down year last year, can bounce back. And I think he has a long NBA career ahead of him. Do you think that one of the players involved could be Grant Williams? Does that fill a need for the Grizzlies?
Not really. And the reason why is because it's just the depth that we already have there. Jonas Valanciunas or Kyle Anderson likely is going to be, I think, in Memphis longer than this year. That's one potential front court player. And then you've got Jaren Jackson, you've got Xavier Tillman, you've got Brandon Clark. And I truly do think that all three of those players have more of a longer term, a higher ceiling as far as being in player value goes going forward. So as much as I love Grant Williams from a roster perspective, there's just not a lot there. See, that's the thing that it comes down to at the end of the day. Those three players that I mentioned to you at the first part of the offer, those are the type of players that could have a role in Memphis moving forward. Beyond that, I just don't know of anybody on Boston outside of the obvious off the table guys that would make sense.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. This is going to be maybe a little too much of a reach for the Celtics. That I understand the notion that Kyle Anderson could be traded, and I will not be surprised if Kyle Anderson is traded by the Grizzlies. But like you said, Shawn, I don't see Boston being able to make that deal unless I think it would have to be all the other offers from around the league don't pan out.
Correct. And I could, and I do agree with that. Now, John, I would like to get your perspective on something though, because there's another player who could possibly make some sense if y'all really needed shooting. Grayson Allen. I know that he's probably not of the same ilk, but from the perspective of someone such as you with Boston, if you don't get your first wave, is Grant Williams the type of player that, or excuse me, is Grayson Allen the type of player that could make sense? That's where 2 seconds could possibly enter the fray?
I just have a strong distaste for Grayson Allen.
Okay. All right.
And I don't know that I can answer that question rationally.
Fair enough.
Because just you asking me the question has stirred up a little kind of bile inside of me. And especially Grayson Allen on the Celtics, I don't want to even hear the jokes.
Of course.
But from a pure basketball perspective, I can see it. Here, the question here is, it's one more year before he becomes a restricted free agent.
Correct.
Are you willing to give up Grant Williams for 1 year of Grayson Allen potentially? Would you rather just try to keep Grant Williams and use him for a different type of deal, find shooting out in the market or something else? So, well, I do understand Grayson Allen. It actually, that could be a move. The fact that the Celtics would then have to turn around and figure out how much he's worth and maybe pay him, that's where I have actual, like, legitimate trepidation. You can get used to Grayson Allen on the team, and if he's helpful, he's helpful. But I hesitate for that, because Grant in 2 seconds aren't nothing. They do have value, and I'd rather bring in somebody like Anderson, who's a more veteran guy that's been around and you can count on. So I think it's a pass, a soft pass on Grayson Allen, basketball wise. The hardest of passes on Grayson Allen, just from John Karalis wise.
And the thing that I'll wrap up with then is, when it comes to Anderson, I think that he's also the type of talent, John, that timing matters. Because right now, I say that, at the start of this, before the next season starts, 2 seconds may not make that much sense. But I'm sure Orlando would have said the same thing about Evan Fournier before he was traded to Boston last year. You look at the trade deadline, if the Grizzlies, if it's not going their way, if they're ready to focus on the future, and you obviously are only going to have Kyle Anderson for a few months at that point, trade deadline, 2 seconds coming to Memphis for Kyle Anderson, maybe it can make sense. So timing also changes perspective.
Yep, that's a great point. And I think it's a great point to leave it. That not likely this summer, but put a pin in it, and we'll see if we can revisit it down the road. Shawn Coleman, Locked On Grizzlies. Check out the Locked On Grizzlies podcast for a fun take on a fun team, and at StatsSAC on Twitter. Shawn, thank you very much.
Pleasure.